From the studios of KENW on the campus of Eastern New Mexico University, it's You Should Know, featuring the people and events of Eastern New Mexico and West Texas.
Welcome to You Should Know. I'm your host, Evelyn Ledbetter, and today I have the pleasure of having Dr. Francine Stuckey as my guest today. Dr. Stuckey, thanks so much for being here.
And I'm happy to be here.
You're kind of coming home a little bit. So, but introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background for those that may not know you.
Okay. I am retired as a professor at ENMU, and I was here for 38 years. I grew up in Kansas and did my first 2 degrees at Kansas State University with a degree in home economics and actually also journalism, and with an emphasis in child and family development. And then I did my master's there as a Education Professions Development Act fellow. That was a program to teach people or help people gain experience in becoming educators in post-secondary, like colleges and universities. And so I did teaching assistantships there and also taught at several community colleges one semester. And then I also did my doctorate at Texas Tech. And while I was there, it was in human development and child development, also in home economics. And I was a preschool teacher in the 4-year-old lab that they had there. So anyway, so that's kind of my professional background, and I'm married and I have 2 children. They're both adults, but and I have 2 grandchildren. So.
And so you moved here to, I would assume you got a position at ENMU and you've stayed.
Right. I came in 1974. I was 22, so I'm not really sure why they decided I was ready for that, except that I did have all that college teaching experience in Kansas, and really was pretty open to going anywhere for a position that would be in higher ed. And I came out here where it was even before I had finished school, and interviewed and really liked the people in the department and really liked having a child development center. Another university that had approached me didn't have a child development center, and that was kind of a selling point because I still felt like that basically I still had a lot to learn about working with children and especially then the people that were here really sold it.
So when you started, what was your position here when you first started? Was
I
it
was
teaching childhood classes?
I was an instructor in home economics, which meant that I mostly taught family and child development classes. I taught, the teaching load was to teach 4 classes a semester. I taught 3 and my load was reduced by 1 class in order to be the director of the Child Development Center. So being the director counted as teaching 1 class.
Oh, it probably counted as 3 or 4 classes.
It was pretty busy. But you know, so many of my students were doing work at the Child Development Center, labs and observations, that it really provided a way for my classes and the things we were talking about in class to be more meaningful because we had that lab.
Well, and you were telling some history that I did not know, and I did not find the information on it, but the CDC, which is the Child Development Center, actually was started in '49, and you said it's been in several locations here on campus.
Right, the very first location, and I wasn't here. I wasn't even born in '49.
No, I'm not insinuating that. Not at all.
But I was interested in the history and actually the building that is currently used and the one that was here when I arrived was very new when I arrived. In '49, it was in an apartment in Vetville. And it was there for actually several years, and then it moved to a building that was next to the administration building. And I never saw that building. It was torn down and turned into a parking lot by the time.
Well, and people may not know that Vetville was actually a veterans, people coming back, they were military, and they had barracks that they kind of fancied up, and they're where the tennis courts are now.
Right,
But-
and people that lived there really enjoyed
So,
it.
so
I
the
think-
children, young families.
And also community people. There wasn't really a nursery school in Portales then. New Mexico didn't have public kindergarten
Right.
in the 40s. And so it provided a lab for the students, the college students, but it also provided a service for the community, something that they really, I think, wanted. But the impetus for it really came from the home economics department wanting a place for their students to learn about children and to work with children.
Well, what's unique, and things have changed so much, kindergartens were not common in the 70s even, or really into the 80s. I know my daughter went to CDC. She started in 90, no, it was 2000. I guess it was 99, 98, 99. But kindergarten was only a half a day then.
Right.
So she went to CDC, and there was a huge waiting list because the great thing, it was such a good program, so well known. You put your kiddo on that waiting list about the time they were born.
That is true. Back then,
It was.
that is the way it was. I think in the early 70s is when the current building was built. So they had been in Vetville in that other building, and then they moved to a building that was designed really for children. The other two buildings were just, an apartment that was kind of renovated, I think, to be
to make it
safe
work.
for the children. But in 1972, Janet Malone was the director, and I did meet her when I came out for my interview, and she's the one that really planned the current building. And it was sort of influenced by the current research, and the British infant school was very popular then and had an open classroom concept, and so I think that had an impact on the building.
I just
too.
remember being so impressed. There was a one-way mirror, so you could watch the children. They couldn't see you, so you could go in and see what your child was doing. And I can remember thinking everything was so organized, and they sat at tables and they served themselves their lunches. And I thought, I have trouble getting one child to do this. How are you getting? I don't know what your enrollment was, but 30 or 40 kids. I thought
We had 50.
I
when
thought,
I
how do you make
started.
50 of these kids lay down and take a nap? And I thought, wow, this is amazing.
Yes, and the observation room was used by lots of different groups of college students, not just, when I was there, not just the child development students, but education majors would come over, but also the child psych class did observations there.
We would always joke about watching the children in their natural habitat because they didn't see the parents,
Right.
so they didn't act different. And so you could see how they truly interacted with the other
Right.
children and the adults and the
And I
teachers.
think a lot of parents really made good use of that. It was really different, I think, for some parents to see how their children interacted with other children, how they interacted
Right.
with it, and then also how they could do so many things that maybe parents didn't know they could do at home, like clean up after themselves, put their things away.
Right, they would pour their milk and pass the plates,
Right.
and yeah, it was
Right.
amazing. So,
Right.
what drew you into early childhood development?
Again, I said I started out with
With
also journalism, and in that you need something to know about, like politics or government or whatever, and I really was interested in writing about children and families. So that's kind of what started it. And then as I went through school and took more classes in child development, then I really got hooked on it. And the thing that I guess helped so much after I arrived here was I really always had an opportunity to work with really excellent teachers, and they were just so good with the children, and it was just a great way to learn about child development and observe children.
And so obviously somewhere along, I mean, you started out, we didn't have kindergarten, so a child didn't even, first grade, they were learning their alphabet, just real basic skills. But what the research that has went into that, obviously those early childhood development is a really important time of a child's life. Will you expand on that some?
Well, I do think that there's a lot of research that shows the birth to age 3 is really critical for things like brain development, and that's why I think that the American Academy of Pediatrics doesn't really want children to watch screens in those early years, because they really need that one-to-one interaction with adults, or maybe not always even one-to-one, but they need that social interaction. That really is one of the ways that language develops, is really through those conversational moments, and you don't get that from a one-way screen.
No.
And so I think that we've just learned, really since I started in the field, more and more about how children's brains develop, and even things like stress and the impact that has on children's brains. So I think that early childhood's really kind of grown and adapted, trying to meet the needs of children, and realizing that really those early years, birth to 5, are really critical for later success. In fact, there were some programs, and this was research that was done probably in the 80s, not here, but I think in Michigan was one of the places. And they found that they had different groups of children, and ones who had an early childhood experience in this really pretty well-designed study, any dollar they put into that was saving at least $7 to $10 later on in things like they were able to get better jobs, further their education farther, less involvement in crime, just a better outcome for them as older children and as adults. And so it was really seen that early childhood could be really an important way to make things better for people for their whole lives.
Well, for me, I worked, but my daughter didn't go to a group daycare. And so for her, she had Sunday school, but there wasn't other social interaction on a steady, regular basis. And so I really wanted her into a program, and that was such a great one to get her interacting. And it amazed me what she learned and the differences. You know, she was in kindergarten close to reading. And I remember back, my kindergarten was like a couple of days a week, but we weren't even close to that. It was more just social skills that we were learning in kindergarten and first grade.
And those are important skills
they
too.
are, but
they are important skills, but
they're so much further advanced. They already have those.
If children have that early experience, it does make a huge difference. And one thing that I would say, that back to kindergarten in New Mexico, when I came in Portales that first year, there was only one kindergarten, and it was half a day. Head Start was already started. It had started in 1965. But kindergarten in New Mexico was just gradually added, and it was optional. Children didn't have to go. And actually, I don't even think that very first couple of years schools even had to provide it. It was, but optional. Then they added funding for half a day later in the 70s, and then moved on into having it be mandatory. First came, we always saved 25 slots. We had 50 children. We saved half of those for kindergartners, because the public schools did not only have that one kindergarten.
Right.
And so that's really when the high demand for those slots, why people would put their children on the list so early, because there were only 25 slots and lots of people wanted them. And so as the public school added kindergartens, then we could take more 3- and 4-year-olds. And now that they have pre-K and kindergarten, then they can take a younger children. And really, even back in the 70s and 80s, I can remember at least twice when I went with college students who were really interested in us working with younger children. We didn't have the room to do that, but I went with them, and actually one time had a state surveyor for child care programs to come and see if some of the buildings that were near campus that the campus owned could be used to help us serve younger children. And so that was really a thing that was wanted from probably since the late 70s or early 80s.
Well, and I'm sure if towns, you normally went to the school within your district of where you lived. So whatever school had that kindergarten, you start seeing those children advance. You don't want your kids to be left behind, because I'm sure the difference of those kiddos going into first grade was huge, that had some preschool than those that didn't.
Yes, and I think it made a huge difference for the children, and also think about the huge difference for the teachers who had some children who that was their very first.
How do you balance that class?
Right, that was the very first time to be in a classroom, and then other children who'd maybe already gone to preschool or another program for a couple of years. So I think that it was more difficult for the teachers as well as for the children.
Right, because how can you teach when everybody is at such a different level of learning?
Right.
Some you're teaching the alphabet, and some are already ready to read or reading.
And I think teachers have always, one of the things we talk about in early childhood is developmentally appropriate practices. And one of the parts of that is to look at individual differences and make sure that you're meeting every child's need. But you also look at age-appropriate things and what you're trying to achieve with that age group. And so you do have to have a balance and look at individual children and what they need.
Are there certain milestones within early childhood development that you see a child's ready for certain things?
There are.
Without getting too technical.
I guess if you look at age-appropriate, we know that there are some things that are appropriate for children of certain ages, and like back to the screen, using screens, that's not appropriate for really young children.
That would be interesting. I'm sure there's a ton of studies about that now, of seeing what the impact is on children that do spend a lot of screen time versus human interaction.
I do, and so that would be one example of something, where you would notice maybe individual differences. One thing that I think is really important with young children is their language development. And I think that's, some areas we know, children just maybe need more experience with social interaction or more experience to develop self-control. But I do think people get a little bit more concerned if there are language delays for young children.
I know one of my children was very active, and getting him to stay in his seat impacted his reading for a couple of years, because getting him to focus.
Right.
He was much busier doing other things, and he was intelligent, but you couldn't keep him in a chair.
But that would be an example of an individual difference. He is maybe more active than the typical child in that classroom.
And so, you learned to sit him at the front of the class where he couldn't see what was going on, and, he caught up quickly, but it just had to click, and it wasn't quite there. It took a little longer.
The fact of changing where he was sitting would be an example of maybe accommodating for an individual difference.
Right. It was just we couldn't have distractions.
Right. And that's probably not that unusual with young children.
So we spent some extra time reading, and there was a book called Leo Blooms, and one day he bloomed, and he surpassed, but there was concerns, and I thought, thank goodness they had those childhood classes that worked through those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so,
that's true.
So big differences on that. Do you think the philosophy has really changed over the years as far as the goals and things?
I think that the philosophy probably hasn't. I think the Child Development Center still tries to approach the whole child and looks at all areas of development, so physical, social, emotional, and cognitive development. I think they still try to not just be an academic program, but realize children learn through play. They develop social skills through interacting with other children. But we have come up with this term of developmentally appropriate practices, meaning you do what's age appropriate, or that's what you plan, but you look at individual differences and try to accommodate those and not expect that everyone's
Right.
going to be able to sit for the same amount of time.
They're
or
not cookie
whatever.
cutters. 'Cause
Right.
I hadn't thought about that. His social skills were amazing. So you had
Right.
some children that were very
Right.
introverted and
Right.
still had that separation anxiety from being
Yes.
away from their
Yes.
caregiver. And so you're focusing on that with some children versus other things.
Right. And then the other part of that is, I think we realize now that we need to consider the context of the child, because maybe there's a difference in cultures that children might have a different outlook or way to interact with adults, maybe depending on their
Very
cultural
true.
background.
Very true.
And then I had a student, several from the Four Corners area, but one of them who explained that in her culture, certain kinds of things that you might display in a classroom might not really be appropriate, might be considered scary for the children or just
Right.
not appropriate. And so you kind of have to look at where you are too.
We're getting a little shorter on time, but talk a little bit about what this does for the students here at Eastern that are able to work in that
the
environment.
college students?
The college students that have this opportunity.
You know, that's one of the reasons, again, I said earlier that I came to Eastern. I think that several ways. One is a lot of students, like from child psychology, have the opportunity to observe children. Another thing would be certain classes like we used to have, and maybe I hope they still do, but students in the speech and hearing program who would come and do hearing exams with the children and check their language and their vocabulary and things like that. And I think that, so we served other children or other college students, not just the home ec, at early childhood majors, elementary ed majors, special education majors.
I remember music majors even.
Music majors would come over. Also, one year we had, probably more than 1 year, we had some students from an HPE class who came over and did physical activities with the children. So it really works well with a lot of college students. And then we had master's degree students who did some research, one actually with music. We also had a professor who was working on her doctorate who was developing a intelligence test for hearing impaired children or deaf children, and she used our children as a control group.
So the benefits in so many different ways.
So many different.
We only have a couple of minutes. Do you remember one story of a child or a family that really made an impact on you?
You know, there are lots.
I'm
some
sure.
Are funny.
With 40 years of education.
Right. Some are funny. Some are maybe more serious. There are actually quite a few, but one that I think about a lot was we had a little girl named Mary. We had a teacher that year who wanted to do a fundraiser for St. Jude's Children's Hospital. And so we had a trichathon, is what St. Jude's was recommending, that the children would try to raise money based on how many laps they could do with their tricycle. And Mary raised quite a bit of money. Part of it, her mother said, was she donated her tooth fairy money.
Oh.
I think that maybe she was really touched by children being in a hospital and children maybe not being as healthy as she was.
Right.
And I still think, you know, for a 5-year-old to give up your tooth fairy money is a big deal.
Oh.
And I still think about just how you don't usually think of young children being that empathetic.
Right.
Because they are still working on a lot of their social and emotional development.
But the purity of heart at that age
is
pretty amazing.
And so that's one that really touched my heart. When her mother told me
she gave her
that
money
she gave up her tooth fairy money.
Quarter tooth.
Yes.
I'm sure you could write a book this week.
Right.
Our time just goes by so quick.
I know.
I know we didn't get to a lot of things, but I know your impact has just been amazing in this in so many different lives and family lives, and my daughter's life and my life. And just want to thank you for what all you did
yes. It
through
was,
your career.
I loved going to work at the CDC. And really, I didn't retire because of not liking my work. I just needed a little bit more flexibility,
Right. To get to enjoy some things.
flexibility so I could do some other things with my family.
Very nice. Well, thank you for joining us
Yes.
today. And again, thank you for everything
Okay.
that you've done for all of our lives.
Yes. Thank
And
you.
to all of you for watching today, thank you. And we will see you again next time. Cheers.